injury and workers' comp lawyer, Richard Gordon of GordonLawChicago.com. He's also done extensive work with professional athletes. So if you slip on a banana peel at the grocery store, or if you get hurt playing in the Super Bowl, he's your guy.
That's right. That's right.
It's a pleasure to have you on. I really appreciate it. We had to reschedule last time, but we have you now. So, thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Steve. I appreciate being here.
Definitely. So, I mean, there's a lot in what I just said: personal injury, workers' compensation, and medical malpractice, and all these different things that we talked about. Tell us what you do in your own words.
Sure. I own a law firm in Chicago that handles personal injury and workers' compensation matters. And so on the personal injury side, we represent folks who are injured in car accidents, injured in slip and falls, on the banana peel, like you said. We represent folks who are injured by defective products, and we represent folks who are, injured by doctors. And on the workers' compensation side, we represent just regular factory workers, cops, firefighters, airline attendants, factory workers. And then we have kind of a unique practice too. We represent professional athletes in workers' compensation. And so we represent players on the Chicago Bears, Blackhawks, Cubs, Sox, the Fire, the Sky, and the minor league teams in the state as well.
Yeah. And, we'll get into all those things individually, but the big one is obviously the professional athletes. You had an interesting story that you told me on the phone when we first spoke, and we had a really good conversation. You dug in a little bit about how you got started in law, working with family, and, how you kind of, had, it's a strange circumstance that you got in, to the professional athlete thing, because that's a big deal. I mean, that's big time. So tell us that story. How did you get into practicing law? Tell us that story about, kind of getting into all the things you just talked about.
Yeah. Well, it's in the family blood. I come from a long line of lawyers. My father was a lawyer in Chicago, as well as his brother, a couple of his brothers. And it was just a natural fit for me. I attempted to rebel when I was younger and was going to go into some other areas, but really the law was always where I was meant to be, I think. And so when I graduated from college, I went to law school, and from there, I've been practicing about 20 years now. And I started off representing insurance companies and really kind of doing the opposite of what I do now. I was representing insurance companies, helping them avoid having to pay for accidents.
Right.
I did that for a while. That's how I learned to be a lawyer. And I also learned that wasn't really where I was meant to be. I've always been a believer in fighting for the little guy, and, working for the insurance companies and their billion-dollar profits. It didn't really sit well with me. And so eventually I left that practice and started working on the plaintiff side, on the side of the injured folks. Mm-hmm. And I was very fortunate to have an opportunity to go work with my father. He was a lawyer in Chicago as well. And, that's how I got into the professional athlete realm as well. It's kind of a funny story, and I probably told it, 10,000 times over the years, because that's what everybody asked me is, how did you get into representing professional athletes?
Right.
The story is, it's a true story. The NFL Players Association in the early 1980s decided they wanted to have a panel of attorneys, and they wanted one or two attorneys in each NFL city to recommend to the players to handle their workers' compensation claims. Believe it or not, when a Bears linebacker tears an ACL on the field, it's the same as when a factory worker tears his ACL on the factory floor. The same laws apply. And so the original guy who was chosen for this panel in Chicago was a guy named Jeff Jacobs. And Jeff Jacobs, some of you may know, was also the president of Harpo Studios and Oprah Winfrey's partner and manager. And so in addition to that, he happened to be my father's law school roommate. So suffice to say, it was growing up with a friend like that. I was very fortunate. Went to a lot of Michael Jordan Bulls games and 1980s Bears games in skyboxes and all that. Yeah. Which was really neat. But Jeff called my father in the mid 1980s and said, Gil, I'm busy making $1 billion with this Oprah Winfrey lady. I don't have time for this NFL stuff anymore. Do you want to do it? And my father said, sure, and got on this panel and did it for 30 years. And when I went to go work with him, this was around 2008, I was able to get on this panel as well. And, I've been on it ever since.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that is definitely a story. I can see why you tell it so many times, because there's a lot of happenstance that that worked out there, right?
It's a fun story. It's one I enjoy telling. And my father passed away about 7 years ago. And, it's one of those stories where it always puts a smile on my face thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It's, there's something to, kind of taking up the family business, like it's, when you follow in your family footsteps, it's an interesting thing, and not everybody does that. Like you said, you were going to rebel, right? So what was on your mind when you were thinking about rebelling? What direction were you thinking about going?
Just about the opposite direction of being a lawyer. I was going to be a computer programmer.
Oh, there you go.
I was into computers when I was a kid, but it turned out when I went to college and started looking at that it wasn't really it wasn't meant for me.
Sure.
I wasn't really a math guy. I didn't have the head for that, but I've always been interested in writing. I've always had a love for reading and arguing and debating. And it just really was a natural fit for me. And even looking back on it, it was always what I was going to end up doing, I think.
Yeah.
But to your point also, it's easy to rebel. I think it's harder to recognize that you're just meant to do something.
Yeah.
And so, and it was, and that's probably one of the reasons that I started out on my own instead of, working with the family from the very start of my career. I needed to learn how to do that on my own. And there was something to that. And so that when I did go to work with my father, I'd already been practicing for about 8 years, knew how to be a lawyer, and was able to really learn that much more because of it.
Yeah. That, I have a parallel kind of story with that as far as working with family. And, so I started doing sales, kind of like working with family when I was 14. It was like I was in high school still. So working with family can be very difficult as well. And one of the things when you start working with family and you don't have that experience being on your own to kind of find your own way, it is even more difficult. So, in my situation, I started out working for family and I had to leave and work for other people, and then kind of it circled back around. It's definitely,
and that's interesting how life kind of runs in circles like that, right?
Definitely. And I talk to so many different types of people on this show. It's very strange how people have very similar stories about totally different circumstances, but there's a lot of parallels in the way a lot of people kind of live their life and become successful and kind of find their fit. So I'm happy to hear that you found your fit. It sounds like you definitely have. One of the really interesting things that you mentioned there was that you started out being the total opposite, working for basically the enemy, I guess you would call him right now. And that had to give you some really serious perspective. Now, how does that play in having the experience being on the other side of the table, in what you do now? How does that work?
Well, I think it gives me, I think that's a great question, Steve. I think that having spent so much time working for the defense side, working for the insurance companies, it gives me a very unique insight into the way they operate and the way that they think. And so what that allows me to do in my cases today is I'm able to look at the case and frame it from a defense perspective. And I think to myself, and I talk to to the lawyers that work for me and my staff, what would we do if we were on the other side here? What is their best argument? And that's kind of how I approach every case is what is the best argument that the defense has to this case? Let's frame that up and then let's figure out a way to overcome that. Right. And I found that's just been incredibly helpful in getting some of the great results that we've gotten for our clients.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's, you also mentioned that you like to debate, and that's kind of one of the main, they teach you that as far as debate, put yourself, find the other person's, point and make it for them. And that goes into anything when you're doing sales or anything like that. If you can, kind of get that common ground and make it like where I'm saying what you're thinking. So where are you going to go from there? You already won. Now you're in their head, right? So there's
exactly.
a lot. Yeah,
exactly. And, and I'm and to the lawyers that work for me, I'm kind of a broken record. Every case we talk about, I'm constantly saying, what do we need to prove our case and how are we going to prove it? Right. I think that's really the end question on every matter that we litigate, and what we're kind of thinking of every minute of every day. And in order to answer that question, you gotta know what the other side's thinking.
Right.
It's easy to buy into the idea that the victim is always the victim and the insurance company is always out to screw everybody, but right. Really it's more nuanced than that. And we need to find our arguments within the law and within the court system, and you got to be creative at that sometimes. And the more creative the more you can think outside the box and be creative, I think the more successful you can be for your clients.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, the law is written, but you're dealing with people, and the determination is made by people. Even though there is a law, and there's a lot of wiggle room with that, I find, with a lot of things.
Absolutely.
So, I mean,
at the end of the day, when any of these cases, go to a trial, if you can't settle the case, it's 12 people, random people off the street who they're going to be told what the law is. But at the end of the day, they're going to use their own life experiences and their own past and all that to come up with an answer. And so you have to be able to apply the law to the reality of the situation, to the reality of life.
Well, that's a good point. I think, people don't think of that a lot of times, about the reality of the situation is different than sometimes what's on the paper. What's on the page is not necessarily reflective of, the real world in a lot of cases.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so now how many, I guess what percentage wise, how many cases would you settle? Can you come to a kind of an agreement before it goes to trial? And, what's your favorite? Do you like doing the settling, or do you like going into trial and really making, playing what's now I'm losing my train of thought with that, but who's the TV lawyer? Matlock, right? Do you like being
Matlock or Perry Mason or
right,
or even the guy in Law and Order? Sure.
Yeah. Do you like to be Matlock, or do you like to kind of handle it behind closed doors?
The reality is that 98% of cases settle before trial. Yeah. And what that means, though, they don't necessarily settle immediately. They settle somewhere between the day you sign up the case and on the courthouse steps the day of the trial. And so that's, regardless of what I want or don't want, that's almost always what happens. Now, there's that 2% of cases, which translates to a couple of cases a year that, for a variety of reasons, we end up going to trial. And any trial lawyer will tell you that that's what they live for. That's the most fun thing to do. Yeah. Is when you're working 20-hour days, for weeks at a time to put on a case. There's really nothing better. Yeah. And that's been a lot of fun to do those kind of things. But they're few and far between is the reality too. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's everybody sees on the TV, the TV lawyer making the case and everybody gasps, right? Like, you made your point.
Yeah, that one's there's a little bit of creative license in those shows. The reality is that the cases that we litigate, there's no gotcha moments quite like they had on Perry Mason or Matlock. It's sure. What the world's going to look like going into it. And the real question comes down to what I was saying before. It's how well are you able to present that case to 12 people off the street, 12 random peers in your jury, and how well are you able to sell them on the facts that you have?
Yeah. Yeah. And now a few different things that we touched on when we had our conversation, and I guess there's ethics that go into it too. Have you ever had a client that you just knew was lying?
I can't say that I've had a client that I just knew was lying. If I knew a client was lying, frankly, I wouldn't take that case. But there are times where as the case develops, you recognize that it's not the facts aren't quite the same as maybe you were led to believe at the start of things, and and a lawyer has an obligation to his client, but also an obligation to the truth. And so that can be a difficult line to toe sometimes. But at the end of the day, I have an obligation. There's rules of professional responsibility, and frankly, there's reputation and morals and ethics. And so I've never had a situation arise where I felt I had to compromise any of my morals to represent a client. But certainly, if I ever felt like that, it would really be a no-brainer to me that that's just not a case for me to handle.
Yeah.
And I would shake my client's hand and tell him good luck.
Well, that's good to hear. Yeah. Lawyers have a bad reputation in a lot of cases about kind of, especially when it's, that type of thing that you're dealing with, everybody kind of sees, and we talked about this before too, there's a perception, I think, with personal injury and, hey, it doesn't matter if you slipped and fell, or if you hurt your back doing this, or I guess people will always try to say, oh, hey, you should get a lawyer. You can make some money on this, even if it really wasn't, the place's fault.
Again, it's lawyers get a bad rap because of TV, but lawyers also get a bad rap because there's like anything else. If you pick out the bad cases, it's easy to shine a spotlight on some of the bad conduct. But the reality is, most of those bad cases, first of all, they're few and far between. Mm-hmm. And even some of those bad cases really aren't bad if you really look at the facts. There was that case, maybe it was 10 or 15 years ago, where the woman sued McDonald's because she spilled hot coffee in her lap and got burned. And people would talk about that case as an example of the judicial system gone awry. Right. But in reality, my understanding is that woman sustained severe third-degree burns because of the coffee. And it may sound a little ridiculous when you think about the facts there, when you hear those for the first time. But the reality is that there was an injury that was caused by someone else's negligence, but caused by someone else's mistake. And that's what lawyers are here for, is to represent folks who are injured because someone else screwed up. Yeah. And it doesn't need to be on purpose, and it doesn't need to be with malice. Mm-hmm. And it rarely is, frankly. Most of my cases are the defendant had a bad day. Yeah. The defendant wasn't paying attention and ran into somebody, or ran a red light, or whatever it was. And so that's most of what I find is there. It's not so black and white, but rather it's all gray. Yeah. Most people are good people in this world, I think, at the end of the day, and you need to have rules and laws to protect people, whether it was someone's fault or not.
I agree. Yeah. And now that is interesting though, because people kind of just assume like, oh, there's a liar, or, somebody, there's a right side and a wrong side. I think that they have to teach that case with McDonald's in law school. It has to be, brought up by plenty of professors, because that is, and I'm familiar with that, not as much as you, I'm sure, but it seems silly that somebody wouldn't know that the coffee's hot, and if they spill it, it'll burn them. But what is the burden of proof? I guess I don't know the lingo, but what is it? Now you say it's not malice. It's not they meant to burn this lady, or they meant to do something or whatever, but it was, what is it that you have to prove to win that case, to win that argument?
Well, so it depends on the case you're talking about. And I don't want to get too far afield. I don't know the details in and out on that McDonald's case, but if you take, just as an example, a more simple example would be a rear end car accident. And so if you're driving a car and you get rear-ended, the Illinois Motor Vehicle Code, there's a whole set of statutes and one of them is you can't follow someone so close that you can't avoid an accident. So if you rear-end somebody, it's almost always your fault because you were following too close. And, there could be, maybe you weren't paying, if you had been paying a little more attention, you would have been able to pump the brakes faster. Maybe the conditions were bad, but at the end of the day, as a driver, you have an obligation to follow the rules of the road. Yeah. And so the burden of proof is, would a reasonable person in that position have acted like that? Did you follow these rules? And if they didn't, then they're liable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's why you have insurance too.
Right. Yeah.
It's to cover mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. People make mistakes. Everybody's guilty of that. Everybody's had a close call. If you haven't, then you probably haven't driven too much. So it's
exactly. Here's a funny story. I was just the other day, I was driving and I got rear-ended by a lady. I was sitting at the intersection, stopped at a stoplight.
Oh, wow.
And some lady comes up and slams into me from behind. And she gets out of her car and runs up to me and says, "I'm so sorry. I wasn't paying attention. I fell asleep." That's literally what she said to me.
Wow.
And I'm thinking to myself in the moment, first of all, am I okay?
Yeah.
I'm kind of doing like a mental assessment of myself.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm thinking to myself, man, this lady just basically admitted to the entire case.
Yeah.
That you could have a big case there.
I was going to say, you're the wrong person.
But you know what? But I wasn't injured. And it's not. And this gets back to, what you were saying before, how,
good example.
Lawyers have this bad reputation. So my friends will ask me if I have a neck brace in my trunk, why don't I just go grab that and put it on or something? But that's just not how we operate.
Yeah.
At least that's not how I operate. At least I don't have any neck braces in my trunk.
Well, that's good. Yeah.
But the reality is that lady has insurance to cover this exact situation when she makes a mistake.
Yeah.
That's why I have insurance. That's why you have insurance.
Yeah. Yeah. And you could have very well just decided, okay, I'm going to do this, and you would have a case and you probably would have made some money on that, right? I mean, that's a clear cut and dry type of instance, isn't it?
I mean, so there's really three parts that we look at to any case. There's liability. And in this case, yes, there was clearly liability. She was at fault. But then there's also the damages and a pocket to pay the damages.
Right.
And there were no damages. And I didn't know if this lady had insurance or didn't and all that. But certainly from the liability perspective, absolutely. And so that's what we look at when we get a new call for a case. We'll look at those three pieces. And if we have all three, then we'll move forward. But we don't move forward unless there's all three of those pieces are there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that goes to ethics, definitely. And I can appreciate that. That's a wild story that you just told that actually happened in real life. That's a great example. I was going to say she hit the wrong person. That's for sure. But no, that's really great. I mean, it makes sense to me. And it is also interesting that, that is the truth, though. If people don't realize that if your front end hits anything, then you're pretty much liable, right? I mean, unless it's some freak thing where you spin around or something, I figure. But if you're moving in a direction and you don't stop, then you're pretty much the person at fault in any situation, pretty much.
About 95% of the time, I would say that's true. There's some instances where, the car in front of you could do something that causes the whole problem, but or you could be hit from behind and be pushed into somebody. But generally, yeah. I mean, if you're the one who does the rear ending, then you're probably at fault. Yeah.
Yeah. And another point that you brought up, I mean, the third part of that is if somebody hits you, if you're going to make a case against them, if they don't have insurance and don't have any money, then you're not getting much out of that, right? So how do those cases work? If somebody gets really seriously injured and the person, for instance, doesn't have insurance, how do you navigate that?
Well, so that does happen plenty of times. In an auto case, in an automobile accident, usually one of the parties has insurance. So even if the guy who hits you doesn't have insurance, you probably have insurance. And with your insurance comes what's called underinsured or uninsured motorist coverage. And so that covers you if the person who hits you either has no insurance or has less insurance than you do. Yeah. You're covered up to your own insurance in Illinois.
Okay. And states are different, right? So Illinois, we kind of have more protections than some other
states. All states are different, but Illinois is a pretty protective state for the laws for injured motorists. But I think most states have laws requiring insurance and requiring uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage.
Okay. Yeah, and we're talking a lot about Go ahead. Oh,
I'm sorry. One thing I was going to say, though, is, one kind of piece of advice that I always like to give people is you're probably underinsured yourself. Most of the people we run into don't have enough insurance than they should have. And that can, the reality is you're going to get in a car accident. I think they say every 18 years. So in your lifetime, you're going to be in 2, 3, 4 car accidents. And the guy who hits you almost certainly is going to have less insurance than you have. And you got to think about what are your financial needs? What happens if you get hurt and can't work? the difference between $100,000 in insurance and $300,000 in insurance is not a very significant difference in your premium. And what I find with my clients and just colleagues alike is people are woefully underinsured.
Yeah. Yeah. And, if you do end up getting hurt, those medical expenses can be just astronomical.
Well, not only the medical expenses, but everyone thinks they're Superman. Everyone thinks it's going to be someone else who gets hurt. It's not going to be them, that they're a good driver. They're smart. They know what they're doing. But the reality is in doing this for 20 years, people's lives change in an instant.
Yeah.
I've seen it both on the defense side and on the plaintiff side, people who sustain just horrible injuries, lifelong injuries that they're never able to recover from. And oftentimes they are not able to be made whole. I mean, certainly it's hard to ever come back from something that creates a disability in you physically. But the reality too is that most people aren't made whole in these cases. Most people walk away very unsatisfied because they are limited to the insurance that's available.
Yeah. Yeah. And, we're talking a lot about the car accident type of thing, but that's not all you do. I mean, workman's comp is another big part of what you do as well. Give us maybe just a little rundown of really what that means for people that aren't quite sure. And just tell us a little bit about kind of how you operate in that field.
Sure. So workers' compensation is a set of laws in the state of Illinois that covers every worker in the state of Illinois. And what that means is if you're injured at work, it doesn't need to be anybody's fault. It just has to arise out of your work. So if you're, working, just as an example, we have a case right now where a factory worker ended up getting his arm caught in a giant machine and had a real bad injury because of it. And it wasn't his fault. It wasn't the company's fault. Nobody was negligent, but it happened at work while he was doing his job. And that's what the law covers. It covers you for injuries caused at work while you're doing your job. And just to take a step back, oftentimes I hear from potential clients that, well, I don't want to cause waves. I don't want to cause a problem with my employer. The reality is Illinois was one of the first states to pass workers' compensation laws back in the early 1900s to protect workers. And the trade-off, the workers and the industry made a trade. The workers said, we'll give up our right to sue you for negligence. We'll give up our right to get damages when the accident was caused by the employer's fault, by a faulty machine, by faulty maintenance, things like that. In exchange, you have to cover us, even if it's an accident that's not anybody's fault.
Oh, wow.
And so it's a trade-off. And at the end of the day, anyone who's injured at work in Illinois falls under these protections. And so these protections provide three different buckets of benefits. So the first is that your employer is obligated to pay your medical bills that are related to the accident. And that includes hospitals, physical therapy, rehabilitation, training for a new job if you can't go back to that same job, things like that. Your employer is also required to pay you what's called temporary total disability, meaning that as long as your doctor says you're unable to work, your employer has to pay you as if you're working. Wow. And that it's basically meant to protect people from going bankrupt because of an injury like this. And then finally, the third bucket, and this is usually the first two buckets are covered by the employer before I get involved, but the third bucket is the permanent disability caused by the injury. And, just using an NFL player as an example, a linebacker on the Bears tears an ACL, even if that's surgically repaired, that leg is never the same as an ACL that wasn't repaired, that wasn't torn in the first place.
Right.
And so that's a tenth of a second off your 40-yard dash time, or maybe that just affects in a tiny way your ability to explode or tackle or take on blocks or whatever it is.
Right.
But that's a permanent disability caused by the injury, and you're entitled to recover for that. And so for like a factory worker, who breaks a leg at work, that leg, may lead to arthritis, may lead to the need for future medical care. And so we're able to recover benefits for that permanent disability.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there. I want to talk about the professional athlete part, but I in a minute, but now I just have a question. So say for instance, somebody does get an injury of some sort that isn't severe at the moment, but like you say, somebody develops arthritis or something that makes them incapacitated or where they can't continue working. Now, what happens in that case where it isn't clearly apparent at the moment, but it develops into something that makes you unable to work? Is there something there, or do you have to, make your claim right in the beginning?
It depends. You have 3 years from the date of the injury to file a claim. So you certainly have time to let that medical treatment develop and to see what it is. And that's what we oftentimes advise clients who call us immediately after an accident is, let's see what happens here. Let's see what the doctor says. Let's see if it ends up being surgical. To your point, I mean, if you don't know within, a short period of time whether or not this has caused you an injury, it's probably not a very significant injury. I mean, the folks that we represent have broken bones, torn tendons, torn ligaments, surgical procedures. These are all things that become apparent pretty early on through MRIs and other objective diagnostic testing. But there are situations where things are slower to develop. Back injuries, for instance, a disc herniation is sometimes very slow to develop. And the treatment for that is very conservative at the start by most doctors. And so it takes some time to recognize exactly what you're dealing with. But usually within that 3-year window, if the problem hasn't developed by then it's probably not going to develop, or at least it's not going to develop in a way that we can relate back to that injury.
Now, what if somebody, for instance, doesn't work at the place anymore and it develops, a year after, but they're still in that 3-year period? Are they still able to file a claim after leaving employment?
You absolutely are able to file a claim after leaving employment as long as the injury arose out of the employment. And what you'll need is proof. Essentially your doctor is going to have to connect the employment to the current state. And so that's what we do is the medical records and the testimony of your treating doctor is going to be what determines whether you're successful or not.
Yeah.
So it's not as simple as, I hurt my knee, I hurt it at work, go get me money. And that's maybe how a lot of people look at it.
Yeah.
The reality is that we spend a lot more time working with your doctors and going through your medical records than we do anything else in preparing these cases, because it's the medical records that support whether or not there's a claim there.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And there is that misconception like, oh, well, my back's killing me. I got a claim, I'm going to call them up. But it could cost you a lot of money up front by having to go to the doctor to even diagnose it. Right. So generally those settlements are to cover and make you whole. It's not to make you rich. Right. I mean, that's what the laws are for.
And nobody's getting rich on workers' compensation either. The laws in Illinois, there are caps on the damages. There's caps on essentially how much somebody can recover. Yeah. In my experience, the more severe the injury, the less likely it is that any monetary value that you can receive is going to really make you whole.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Definitely. And so, to tie it back to the professional athlete, because this is, kind of what a lot of people are interested in with, that's an interesting story. I mean, people don't think, okay, well, if Tom Brady tears his ACL, that he, needs a settlement, right? So people don't think because, these people are multimillionaires, they don't need the money. People always tie it to money, but
absolutely.
The other thing that
the reality, Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
The other thing that you mentioned that I wanted to touch on is, think about the minor league athlete or, somebody that, makes $40,000 a year or something that really needs that money, that's ruined. Maybe their career would have gone somewhere and now it can't. So,
absolutely.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, here's a great example of that. I would say every single year, the Chicago Bears will have an undrafted rookie free agent that will tear an ACL in training camp and his career will be ended.
Yeah.
And in training, these guys, sure, they sign these big contracts, but they're not paid the contract until the actual NFL season starts. And so the guy who comes on board as an undrafted rookie free agent or even third, fourth round pick who tears an ACL and then never plays again, that guy was making maybe $200 a week on a stipend, just a living expense stipend during training camp.
Right.
And that's all that guy is known is playing football. And he was hired to play football, got hurt because he was doing what he was hired to do, and now can no longer do that job. And so there is an obligation, I think, for any employer to pay for those kind of damages. I mean, this is entertainment. The football industry is an entertainment industry at base, and and it's part of the game that you're going to get hurt, but it's also, there are rules in place to protect people. And these guys, to your point, also, a minor league baseball player. There are a dozen or so minor league teams in Illinois. Minor league baseball players are making $1,100 a month. Players on the Chicago Fire, the Chicago Sky, most of them are making under $100,000 a year. Players on the Chicago Wolves or the Quad City Mallards or the Rockford Ice Hogs are not making millions of dollars. These are folks who are making, regular wages, and the injuries that they sustain are lifelong injuries. These guys are, if you ever see a retired professional athlete walking around, I don't think you're seeing them running in a marathon. You're seeing them hobbling and limping, because that's what their employment does to them. Yeah. It creates these lifelong injuries, and the notion that there's some line in the sand you can draw that because a guy made $1 million last year, nobody who makes any money should get anything is, I think, just arbitrary. Yeah. It's funny you brought up the Wolves. I actually had the VP of operations for the Chicago Wolves on the show to talk about kind of, the organization and player development. It's a stepping stone for a lot of these athletes. They come out, it's a job that they take on so they can get exposure, and then they move into, other leagues. And, like you say, they're not making millions of dollars. They're usually young guys that, they're bringing in from, different places. And, it's heartbreaking. And she was saying the same thing, people get hurt and it's like their family. And, that's an example of a good organization that, takes care of people for the most part, I figure. But have you encountered those minor league teams that exploit players, or, have there been any horror stories, without going into details? But how do you navigate that? Because you deal with these people, you hear the real stories when people are being hurt. What can you say on that? I don't think that there's any horror stories per se. In my experience, kind of the lower you get down into the professional ranks in terms of the minor leagues, the less sophisticated maybe some of those folks are in terms of understanding how the laws operate. And so sometimes it's a little harder. Sometimes you have to educate a little more on, what the obligations are. Just using the Wolves even as an example, the Wolves were an affiliate of the Vegas Knights, right, for the last few years. And the Vegas Knights decided they didn't want to be a part of it anymore because they didn't want to have to bother with workers' compensation. They weren't used to that system, and they didn't feel like it was something that they should have to pay for. So they said, forget it, we're out. Wow. The reality is these are $1 million companies, $1 billion companies. And it's really part of the bottom line is you have to pay to keep your workers safe. Yeah. Yeah. It's a cost of business, right? The corollary to that would be, you don't see United Airlines cutting safety measures because, on their planes, they spend the money that's necessary to do the right thing for their customers and for their employees. Yeah. Well, it's the equal. And so rarely, just kind of answer your question, rarely do I see bad actors in it. More often it's, there's more often a healthy debate about the merits of a claim or the impact of a claim and things like that. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess the term really is what, equal application of under the law, or something, it's like everybody, yeah, whether you're a billionaire, or you're making, $50 or something, if you're actually employed, then it's the same thing, goes, all the way across. And I think people don't realize that, but especially for sports though, people always think of, the top of the top, in the NFL or the MLB. But even if you're talking about those guys at the top, those guys who are making millions of dollars, when they have serious injuries, yeah, think about that. They go from making, $5 million a year to being unemployable. Yeah, right. The guy who was making $5 million and gets hurt, he's no longer able to do that. Not only is he no longer able to do that job, but then what job is he going to be able to do? Yeah. These guys know nothing other than their sports for the most part. And that's why, you see in the data, The bad results of players after retirement. You see a lot of guys going bankrupt, a lot of guys making bad financial business decisions because they've been trained to be this one thing.
And you also
and now
brought
they
it up.
Can't do that anymore.
You brought it up before. Everybody thinks that they're invincible until it happens in the snap of a finger. And so, I would imagine these people that have multi-million-dollar contracts, they're spending, they're thinking the money's going to come because they got 3 more years on their contract. They know what they're going to make. And then it's can't do it anymore. So that definitely makes a lot of sense. And you represent those guys. Somebody has to do that. So what does a day look like if you're dealing with one of these high profile athletes? I know you said, you worked with people on the Bears and, all the different teams around Chicago, but how does that operate? Do you deal with a staff? Do you deal with them is there a team of lawyers, or is it you're one-on-one with the actual athlete? How does that relationship work on your end?
So it works. It's more or less one-on-one with that athlete. Or that athlete and his or her agent is generally who I work with, or his or her, significant other. Mm-hmm. That's generally who I work with, but I make it a point to not have any middlemen involved. Sometimes you get a call from a high profile person who wants it all done through their agent or whatever, their business manager. Yeah. That's not how I operate. I operate in a face-to-face kind of way. I need to make eye contact with my clients and talk to them. And for the most part, honestly, the professional athletes that I've represented have been the easiest clients I've ever had to deal with. I mean, I think that athletes get maybe a bad rap, that they're, some kind of prima donnas. My experience has been the exact opposite. They are almost to a man. They've been polite, respectful, appreciative, and they've been really easy to work with. They follow, they follow my lead, my instructions, and rarely is there any problems, to be honest with you.
Yeah. And now you're in a, I mean, that's really interesting. You're in a kind of a small handful of people that do what you do in this town, I would imagine, right? How many other people out there are doing what you're doing at the level that you're doing it with athletes? I mean, it can't be many.
There's nobody else who's doing it at the level that I'm doing it in the state of Illinois.
Well, that's a pretty big claim. Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, if you're, people get hurt. I mean, we have a lot of teams. We have a lot of athletes in a lot of different leagues. So yeah, that's a big deal. Now and I know, I told you before, when we do these shows, an hour is the snap of a finger as well. We basically are coming up to an hour, but I wanted to close out and, kind of talk a little bit about, some of the other things. Tell me about your business. So tell me about your actual firm. How many people do you have with you? When did you start it exactly? And, I guess, how to get a hold of you? Plug yourself.
Yeah, sure. So we have 4 attorneys in our firm, which is, a decent size for a personal injury firm. We've got a handful of paralegals and support staff as well. We have offices in downtown Chicago, across from the courthouse, across from the Daily Center. And, like I said, I make it a point. We like to meet clients face to face, whether it's in our office or, I travel all around Lake County, Cook County, the collar counties. We represent folks all over the state of Illinois, and I'm happy to come meet you where you're at. I'm happy to come, I consider it a privilege to be invited into folks' living rooms to talk to them, to talk to their families and explain how this stuff all works. The reality is that, what a personal injury lawyer does isn't rocket science, but I think the way you treat people and the level that you put, the amount of energy you put into your clients is what separates the good lawyers from the rest of the pack. And I like to think that we do that better than most. We treat our clients with respect. We really care about our clients, and I think our results show that. If you're ever injured in an accident, whether it's on the road, walking down the sidewalk, or at work, call us. We're happy to talk to you free of charge. You don't pay us anything out of your pocket. We only get paid if we get you paid. And that's really how it is. And so if you have any questions, our website is gordonlawchicago.com. You can reach me at 312-332-5200. We get back to folks very quickly, and we're happy to have a conversation with you.
Definitely. And now to bring it full circle all the way back to the beginning, we talked about this when we had that phone call in the beginning. For the people out there, if you happen to be in the grocery store and you slip on a banana peel, what should you do to make sure that you're protected?
Well, so the slipping on the banana peel, as silly as it sounds, that happens. And whether it's a banana peel or honestly, people slip on the most in a grocery store is grapes.
Ooh,
people slip and fall on grapes all the time. And what's important when you slip and fall on anything, whether it's at a grocery store or when we just had a foot of snow, you slip and fall in a parking lot or on a sidewalk, you got to know what you fell on, what caused you to fall. Look around, take pictures. The single thing that you can do to help yourself in those situations is to take a picture of where you fell, because at the end of the day, a year from the time you fell, you're going to have to explain what did you fall on and how do you know that you fell on it. And you need to know what you know it was a banana peel because you saw it, you smelled it, you felt it, whatever it is, you held it in your hand. You need to know that it was a grape because you looked at the bottom of your shoe and there was a grape there. Okay. And if you have pictures of it, that, pictures go a long way, especially when they're, contemporaneous, when you take it at the same time, that's how you prove your case. Yeah. When you come to me 2 years later saying I slipped on something, I don't know what it is, it's very difficult to recreate that situation.
Yeah.
And so the thing that I would tell anybody who's in an accident is your memory is the absolute best it's ever going to be at that exact moment. And so write down what happened. Write down how you felt, what you noticed about yourself. Write down what caused you to fall, where you were going, what shoes you were wearing, things like that, because it's just my experience is that people just can't remember those kind of details the more time that passes.
Yeah. You're
never going to remember it as well as you are that in that moment.
And the other thing that you brought up, you can't trust if there's video cameras that you're going to get that footage. It might mysteriously disappear by then, So if
between just human error and the reality that those videos are overwritten so quickly, I mean, I think rarely is it is my experience that they're erased on purpose, like the Nixon tapes or something. But the reality is those videos are tough to come by, and who knows what quality they are, who knows what they actually saw. Videos are amazing when they work, but oftentimes they don't.
Yeah. And it's not the defendant's case place to prove your case. Right. So,
well, not only that, I think that's a really good point. The burden of proof is on the person who's injured, the person who's bringing the claim, the person who's filed the lawsuit. The defendant doesn't have to prove that they didn't cause the problem. The plaintiff, my client, has to prove that they did.
Yeah.
And that can be a very difficult burden sometimes. And the more attention to the detail that you bring to your lawyer, whether it's me or anybody else, the better chance you're going to be successful at the end of the day in your case.
Well, that's some wise words from somebody that definitely knows the law. And Richard, it's a real pleasure to have you on. I think we talked about some really interesting things today. Thank you so much for your time. And for anybody like you just said, it's GordonLawChicago.com. Give him a call if you have a question, if you need anything, he's there to help. And, thanks again. Have a good one.
Thanks for having me, Steve. I really appreciate it.
Yep. All right, everybody. That's another one in the books. Thanks for listening. We'll put the link below and have a good one.